Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Annie Jacobsen. Annie is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and the New York Times bestselling author of Nuclear War, Area 51, and Operation Paperclip, as well as The Pentagon's Brain, a Pulitzer Prize finalist in history, First Platoon, Surprise, Kill, Vanish, and Phenomena. A graduate of Princeton University, she was a contributing editor at the Los Angeles Times Magazine. Since Nuclear War became a global blockbuster, Annie has been invited to share her expertise with the United Nations, the Vatican, Nuke Expo in Brussels, and the Japanese government. And her reporting has been featured everywhere, from Politico and the New York Times to Joe Rogan and Sean Ryan. She's joining me to discuss her new book, Biological War, A Scenario, out now and already on the New York Times hardcover nonfiction bestseller list, based on dozens of new interviews with experts at the highest levels of political, medical, and military responsibility. Annie charts the hours and days following the release of a biological weapon, whether by accident or by design, and exposes how unprepared our government, our medical system, and our society are for the threat the Pentagon itself ranks above nuclear war. Coming up, Annie joins me to talk about her new book and why she believes a biological attack or even a simple lab accident poses the single greatest threat America faces today. That's next. Annie, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Well, thank you for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, you spent years immersed in nuclear annihilation. Why did you decide biological warfare was the subject that had to come next?
You know, when I was doing interviews with very high-level officials who deal with that nuclear threat, the concept of deterrence, these are presidential advisors, STRATCOM commanders, former secretaries of defense. Often toward the end of those interviews, it was said to me, a variation of, Annie, you should really look at bio next. And it was said with a deeply disquieting kind of shark in the water feeling that I could not ignore. And looking at the threat is indeed deeply unnerving because it is so great.
When you do nuclear war, it kind of works as a scenario because it's almost mathematical. We know an enormous amount about it. If it's a ballistic missile launch, it's a 28-minute kind of experience. You know where it came from. You know what's going to happen next. Does biological warfare break out of that kind of logic and create a much more complex and hard to understand a management circumstance?
Well, you're precisely speaking to my initial challenge, which was nuclear war is a system and, you know, moment one is followed by moment two, because as you said, it's mathematical and there is a lot of hardware involved. And so you can track hardware and you can track locations and you can move the scenario forward in that situation from nuclear launch to nuclear winter in 72 minutes. Biology, by its very nature, is so much more uncertain, so much more complex in a way because, as it was said to me, biology is squishy. And so I had to decide, after I really started digging into it, how is this scenario going to unfold in a realistic manner? And here's where I got my answer. One of the things I do, and you know this from being in government so long, is I was looking at declassified war game scenarios gamed out at the Pentagon over the years, catastrophic biological incident. And then I was looking at unclassified pandemic planning scenarios by our public health officials. And I had a sort of mic drop moment when I noticed something the same about all of these scenarios, which is that no matter what pathogen was involved And depending on the pathogen involved, it would unfold either, in days, weeks, months, or sometimes even years. But always there was a point in the scenario where everything would stop. Like it was like game over, whether it was military or pandemic planning. And that was always in the moment that anarchy broke out. Literally, it was like game over. And I thought to myself, knowing what I know, being a national security reporter for 20 years, these people know what happens after anarchy breaks out. They are simply not telling us. And that is what I wanted to know. And that is what I found out. And that is what is perhaps the most horrifying about all of this, which you allude to in your introduction.
How much were you shaped by or informed by the actual historic process of COVID?
Most certainly, I was shaped by it. And I get the sense from readers that they are clear that the sort of echo of COVID or the long shadow of COVID underpins the narrative. I use examples from COVID that people can relate to, like a super spreader event on a cruise ship, an adversarial government not being transparent with the United States, how something arrives in the United States by airplane. But these are all illusions too. I'm not hitting COVID on the head per se, because what I had hoped was that people would come away from the book realizing, wow, COVID could have been this incredibly cautionary tale for the United States from which government and society has learned and are now better prepared to deal with this thing. And unfortunately, I believe that what has happened is quite the opposite, that we are actually in an even more fractured society about COVID than we were when I began working on the book.
You make a point that's, I think, very important for people to understand, that back in 1971, Paul Berg is putting together DNA from 2 different viruses in his Stanford lab. Why did that experiment matter so much in the development of the potential danger of biological warfare?
That is the origin story, the sort of origin moment of genetic engineering. And what I try to do as an author and as a journalist is take very complex ideas that exist in society today and make them incredibly easy to understand and therefore to relate to. And sometimes that means going back to the origins of when something began, because then people realize, oh, genetic engineering, genetic modification, gain of function, this all sounds so complex, and I'm just supposed to take for granted that I know what it is, and I really don't. That's my experience with a lot of readers. So I just say, let's go back in time to 1971. Stanford Laboratory, Paul Berg, who would later go on and win the Nobel Prize, creates the world's first chimera pathogen, meaning he put 2 organisms together in a laboratory to create one. It's something straight out of a metaphor of Greek mythology. We can relate to this chimera monster, which we've all seen pictures of in a history book or maybe in a vase in a museum, where you see a chimera is like the head of a lion and the body of a serpent. It's merging 2 existing animals or organisms. That was the first moment, in essence, of genetic engineering. Today, we are very far advanced, and we're talking about systems like CRISPR.
Can you take just a minute and describe CRISPR? Because it's one of the great breakthroughs that makes all this suddenly dramatically easier and more threatening.
You bet. Maybe the best way to wrap the mind around what CRISPR actually is, rather than a scientific explanation, is an analogy. So imagine what Paul Berg was doing in 1971, being like film editing. You can imagine a strip of film, and you have a pair of scissors, and you cut it, and then you take a different strip of film, and you cut that, and then you put them together, and imagine an old piece of cellophane tape holding them together. That is genetic engineering sort of 1.0. CRISPR would be imagining going over to your brand new iMac and using digital images that are already uploaded into your computer with a few keystrokes, making a really quick edit that you can then really quickly upload onto Instagram. And kids right now who are 20 know how to do that in 4 seconds. And those of us that are a bit older have to follow mentally the analogy of old film editing to make this kind of thing make sense.
As we began to develop this ability to shape biology, as you point out, it's really only about 50 years old. The Soviets, during the last phase of the Cold War, had a huge program in biological warfare. And you make the point that we had one defector, Vladimir Pasachnik. He brought us the information. My understanding is that it was an enormous program and that they were quite serious about how they would have used biological warfare if it had come to that.
You know, this is a story that has a lot of nefarious actors and actions, and it very much feels like it begins right there at that moment in time when over 120 some odd signatories to the new Biological Weapons Convention Treaty of 1972 that outlawed biological weapons. During the Cold War, they had been legal. So suddenly they're outlawed. President Nixon calls them odious to the conscience of mankind. Everyone agrees they're dangerous. The United States destroys its arsenal. It takes 219 weeks to do that. But meanwhile, the Soviet Union signs the treaty, crosses its fingers behind its back, and sets about to create an utterly colossal program that is so dark and so nefarious. Their goal, we later learned from the Soviet defector scientists like Vladimir Pasachnik, who you mentioned, we learned from them that the goal of the program was to kill tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people in America and the West, but leave the infrastructure intact. That image really set things in motion for me writing this book. You can kind of like imagine these Soviet troops, you know, landing on the beaches in the American East and West coasts and marching in and all these dead bodies, but the buildings standing, unlike nuclear war, where you would have a radioactive wasteland.
My understanding is that there's a pretty good assessment that Russia, North Korea, and China and Iran probably still operate biological weapon programs.
The U.S. State Department today, their most recent release, which is 2025, and also from the previous administration, state in no uncertain terms, it is their position that Russia and North Korea both have active biological weapons programs and that China and Iran have programs of interest, which I take as a euphemism for probably have biological weapons programs. But there's an important thing to consider in all of this discussion, which is that treaty we were just speaking about from 1972, it has a carve-out in it. And that carve-out says you can keep dangerous pathogens in laboratories, these maximum containment facilities known as BSL-4 and BSL-3 labs, provided what you are doing is you are doing scientific engineering on them solely for prophylactic purposes, a fancy way of saying working on medical countermeasures. And so this has created an extremely dangerous loophole that allows countries around the world to be doing experiments that are extremely dangerous and in a very gray area of whether or not they are themselves biological weapons.
When we come back, Annie walks us through her ticking clock scenario, how one accident at a Russian biolab could spread across the globe in days, and why America's own response system may not be fast enough to stop it. You don't start with a terrorist attack. You start with an accident, which may also have been what happened with COVID. In your case, it's an explosion at Russia's Vector Institute in Siberia. Why did you decide that it was an accidental nightmare rather than a deliberate attack?
You know, having studied national security for decades, I was astonished to learn that in preparing and in understanding and in planning for biological catastrophes, a biological attack, biological war, the only time I have ever seen language that said biological attack or biological incident paired together in the planning. I mean, think about it. If there was a nuclear accident, it would certainly not trigger a nuclear counterattack. It would be nation states coming together. How do we stop this accident and what do we do? It would be very clear it was an accident. And yet Pentagon planning makes certain that the results of a lab leak, that is an incident, that is an accident, a biological incident, are as calamitous as a biological attack. And that is precisely why I began the scenario with a lab leak, essentially an accident at Vector, which has happened in the past, but this time something gets out and it gets out fast, and readers get that shark in the water feel that I experienced as I was reporting this and learning about this, where almost immediately things become out of control, unstoppable.
You talk about having a euphoria gene, which is a factor in the rate of spread. Can you explain why that's important?
Thank you for pointing out perhaps the most nefarious plot point of all. And unfortunately, this is not science fiction or something created by Annie Jacobsen's brain. It is a science fact. And it was relayed to me by one of the world's subject matter experts on plague. That is the pathogen I use in the book. Plague being a bacteria, not a virus. And it was explained to me by Dr. Henry Hine, who worked at USAMRIID during the period of time that biology was extremely heightened in the United States, because that was during the anthrax attacks. And what Hine told me is that all of the scientists at USAMRIID were aware of this super plague weapon that the Soviets had been illegally developing during their program, whereby they spliced a gene for euphoria into the front end of the pathogen. And you might say, well, what on earth would that do? And Dr. Hine explained to me this way. He said, you know, there's always a burnout rate of a deadly pathogen, meaning if enough people get it and they're dying really quickly from it and they're home in bed under the covers, it's going to burn out and not spread. But by inserting this gene for euphoria, the malevolent idea of the Soviet biological weapons engineers was that they would infect people who would then in turn feel absolutely terrific, want to go out and socialize, and maybe even wind up at a crowded disco, which is another plot point in biological war scenario.
You reported that one former Pentagon official told you that when they learned the details of the Soviet biological weapons program, that it changed how he understood the word evil.
That is precisely.
What was it that really got to him?
You know, I think it's very interesting because you know from your long experience in government, Pentagon officials do not toss words like good and evil around a lot. I mean, that is really reserved for a different branch of theology, if you will. And so to have to use that word very precisely really gives certainly this reporter pause, and I imagine it gives readers pause, because you're thinking about something with such ill intent and banking on human nature and manipulating it in the most nefarious way to essentially create more infection. On the other hand, you're looking at nuclear, for example. So many weapon systems are about hardware. You put a 2,000-pound bomb on a target. For better or for worse, the Pentagon knows or believes it knows precisely how many people it's going to kill in that circle. But with biological war, it is deeply unknown how infection would spread. And so I think the evil component is to imagine manipulating an already deadly pathogen to prey upon mankind's human nature of socialization. There's something really twisted about that.
You start with very rapid spread. Walk us through who you used as the carrier and why you used them and what you wanted to communicate about the possibility of really an almost impossible to defend process of spreading.
One of the sets of documents that I looked at for context, because I am using plague as a pathogen, not bubonic plague, which has a lowercase fatality rate and is spread by a flea bite, but pneumonic plague, the more contagious, sort of a dark-hearted uncle pneumonia means it is spread, it is airborne. And looking at these contemporary documents about the Black Death of the 14th century and reading what survivors of that pandemic, it killed half of Europe, 150 million people. Reading those survivors' accounts of what happened to humankind, it's just chilling. I quote a lot of it in the book, and it got me thinking when I came across one particular line about how the plague was spreading across Europe at the rate of human travel. And in the 14th century, that was about 1 mile per day by ship or caravan. And when you look at that in today's travel world, and you know, because many of us have traveled across the world in a day, in a half a day, I suddenly realized that really an incredibly dramatic and terrifying drive of a pandemic today is the speed of travel. And so for that reason, there's an outbreak. There's a lab escape at this laboratory in Siberia, the same one where the Soviets were working on these really dark biological weapons during the Cold War era and probably still are today. And you have a scientist who gets infected. He goes out to his hunting cabin in the forest to kill himself. And instead, he comes across a band of 10 international big game hunters, one of whom is a good Samaritan, sees the man is dying, gives him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And then these 10 hunters go to the airport and travel to 6 of the 7 continents of the world. I was able to use that paradigm to demonstrate how travel works and also how these different personality works. I had one hunter's the Good Samaritan, and I show readers how you're going to be impacted one way if you have that really close contact. Another one of the hunters is a germaphobe, so he stands way back. And I want people to realize, again, this is science fact, not science fiction.
We lived through that during COVID. When COVID first broke loose, there were about 100,000 Chinese who work in northern Italy. And interestingly, the Chinese government allowed planes to leave Wuhan to go out of China, but would not allow planes to leave Wuhan to go in China. So they almost had a period of spreading that must have lasted a good while before it became clear that it was a huge problem, which of course it became enormous in places like Italy with very old populations. It was really staggering. When I read...
If I can interrupt for a moment, because there's a detail I'm going to share with you, which is not in the book, which you and I will both find chilling. So I interviewed a defense official in Italy about this, and it was incredible to learn how upset the Italians were with precisely that information once they realized it. But what I didn't know, and this comes from Craig Fugate, who was Obama's former FEMA director, who was following the pandemic, even though he was not, in a position of authority. And he relayed to me that the majority, if not all, of the original COVID cases in New York City came from Italy. So your theory, it went from Wuhan to Italy to the United States.
Almost nobody understood that there were 100,000 Chinese working in northern Italy.
In the fashion industry, yes.
So it became really explosive in terms of the impact on in Italian society, they didn't have a big enough public health system to cope with it directly. To go on from that, the point which I think you make, which is so important, is once something like this starts to move, every single infected person becomes potentially a carrier, and the rate of multiplication is much faster. If it's a design drug or a design disease to be multiplied, one of the great virtues of things like Ebola has been that they kill you so fast that they don't spread very far because the host dies. You get into the kind of design you're talking about, where it's both designed to be spread. I thought it was brilliant. I don't know if you came up with this yourself, but this whole idea of deliberately fusing it with something which would make you feel good, that's genius, but it's also increasingly terrifying because it would increase the rate of spread. If you're a country considering doing this deliberately, you have to also worry about the blowback in your own population. So unless you had some kind of huge mass inoculation program, which would show up and we'd be aware of it, it's a real risk to start a biological war.
Well, you're absolutely right. And this points to Cold War biological warfare thinking. The original idea was that you would create a vaccine and you would vaccinate your population against whatever evil biological weapon you were going to deploy. Then you would deploy that against your enemy on the battlefield. You would kill all of them and you would all be safe. And when you think of Mother Russia in the Cold War as very much a fortress, people didn't exactly go away to Paris for the weekend. They couldn't. There was literally a wall up, in parts of the Soviet Union. And so maybe that idea had traction for a while. And we know from the Soviet defector scientists and a number of memoirs that have been written that thinking continued on even into like the 80s, where they were working particularly with plague on a vaccine against plague. And that was the idea of using this super plague weapon against the West. But once the wall came down and the world became much more holistic, it became really clear that this idea of blowback that you spoke of is precisely why you wouldn't use a biological weapon, because it would be insane. Because just like COVID, everyone would get it and everyone's country would suffer. And so you have to say at the heart of the matter, well, of course, biological weapons wouldn't be used. But then you cannot say that, because I'm going to throw out some numbers here of the numbers of laboratories we have around the world working on dangerous pathogens under the bizarre, almost paradoxical idea that, well, we better create a defense against a biological weapon that someone might create in case they use it so we can defend against it. So we'll work on this dangerous research. But what if there's a lab leak? Hence why I use the lab leak. So to give you that number, before 9/11, there were 2 BSL-4 labs in the United States. That's the highest maximum containment lab. One at Fort Detrick, that's the Defense Department's lab, and one at the CDC in Atlanta. Now there are 17. There are 15 and then 17, the 2 more about to open. Around the world, there are 110 BSL-4 labs. You can work on Ebola, Nipah, Lassa. These are pathogens from which there is no cure. You get it, you die. BSL-3 labs allow for work on plague, anthrax, hantavirus, these extraordinary deadly pathogens from which there is allegedly a cure, namely antibiotics if you're dealing with a bacteria. But as we've been discussing, with genetic modification, one of the easiest things to do is to tweak the pathogen so that there is no longer a human immunity against it. And around the world, there are 3,500 BSL-3 labs, many of which are in countries that are at war with their neighbors or themselves.
Coming up, Annie takes us inside the most extraordinary part of her reporting, the classified plan, the U.S. government would activate if American democracy itself started to break down. You go to an area that I really want to pursue because I want to ask you about what I think is the most extraordinary part of your reporting, which is the U.S. government's own classified plan of what it would do if you ended up with people panicking and the whole process beginning to break down. Were you surprised to discover the level of planning that had gone into dealing with civil unrest?
I wouldn't say I was surprised. I would say I was shocked. And it takes a lot to shock me. But this speaks precisely to that moment in my reporting that we discussed earlier, where I was wondering, why are all these pandemic planning and biological catastrophic incident war games at the Pentagon ending when anarchy breaks out? Why are they ending there? And so I asked and finally got my answer from Obama's former FEMA director, Craig Fugate, who had helped me tremendously understand about nuclear war, that there is no population protection planning in nuclear war, because I found out from Fugate everyone would be dead. The government knows that, right? So there we go. That's how nuclear ends. But bio is very different. What I learned is that there is a plan that exists. It is classified, as you say. The name of it is unclassified, which is why Fugate could give me details and take readers up to the edge of what can legally be known. It's called the Devolution Plan. It involves a secret, classified list of individuals who have previously been chosen. They know who they are. They have signed contracts. They have rehearsed the Devolution Plan. And when anarchy takes over, and every war game knows that anarchy happens with fear of infection and the scarcity involved with medical countermeasures. Anarchy takes over, the president declares the Insurrection Act, and the Devolution Plan goes into effect once a continuity of government readiness condition of number 1 gets activated. And when you consider that there is this program where the government disappears into the forest, essentially, to these underground bunkers called hot sites, cold sites, and warm sites, to save itself so that it can reconstitute after everyone dies, this is really something that seems very dystopian science fiction. And to know that it exists in your own government is both horrifying and also, I think, so that we don't just go down, an absolutely dark rabbit hole. You say, well, wait a minute, perhaps with this knowledge on the table, all of us collectively as a society need to realize 2 things. 1, something has to be done to put pressure on the dangers of these labs and having a lab leak. And 2, how about some planning for the people?
You do make clear that, this is a very high risk environment, and while it could be catastrophic, that there may well be technological breakthroughs that dramatically transform the ability of public health to operate in virtually real time. And I think that's an important thing. Could you talk about what you've learned about the positive side of new technologies?
Absolutely. Social media and its ability to get the word out in near real time. We've all experienced this when there's a fire burning or some kind of a catastrophe and you jump on X and you immediately realize that there is a lot of news essentially breaking on social media that is not yet reported in the more traditional old school media formats, whether it's radio or television. And so the WHO has also realized this and has a facility in Germany whereby it has a AI-based computational system that is looking at trillions of bits of data in real time about outbreaks that are happening around the world and working to connect the dots, essentially, to try and determine if any of these outbreaks are connected. There are analysts interpreting what the computers are saying. And then there is a pathway to bring this reportage, this AI-based reporting to WHO officials in Geneva. You kind of realize that the stovepipe there is that last component that I mentioned, like the human in the loop. The analysts getting to the WHO officials in Geneva is still happening pretty fast. But how are the officials going to make their decisions about getting that information out to the public immediately? And I had real eyes on this spring when there was both a hantavirus outbreak on a cruise ship in South America and the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. I was really looking at how the WHO was reporting information to the people, knowing what I know, and I relate to readers now about how these computer systems are working. And it seemed to my eye that there still is an extraordinary lag between information getting to the top and the top deciding how to get that information out to the people. Why? There's always the concern of panic.
It's fascinating because the public health services in many ways are classically bureaucratic and are used to doing things the way they're used to doing them. And so you end up with people, for example, using fax machines at a time when there are over 6 billion smartphones in the world. Think about that. In terms of a potential real-time reporting system, people normally every day are carrying around 6 billion smartphones, all of which can be connected and with the use of AI can be analyzed in virtually real time. To me, it's the gap between what we could do technologically and what we can do bureaucratically is getting bigger and bigger and could become, in the terms of the book you've written, a matter of life and death for much of the human race. You've sort of immersed yourself in living at the edge of nightmares. I'm going to put you on the spot. On balance, are you an optimist or a pessimist about us getting through the next half century?
I am by nature an optimist. You can ask my kids. You can ask anyone who knows me well. I am of that old school mindset that knowledge is king or queen. Like the more you know, the more confident you get to feel in this world. That's how I was raised. That's how I was schooled. That's how I report. And so even though I make really clear right in the author's note up front, spoiler alert, there is a dystopian ending here. I make clear in the end of the book in my acknowledgments that the point is not panic, it is pressure. Because I believe that with information, something can be done. It's always lack of information, naivete, ignorance, call it what you will, an inability to face something that really gets the human in trouble individually. It's true in a person's personal life. So it's absolutely true collectively as society, I believe. That's why I think we absolutely can get through the next century.
I think of myself as a strategic optimist, but tactically very worried. Barring a nuclear war, we're going to be much more prosperous. But that's a big assumption.
And now you can add to that barring a nuclear war or a biological catastrophe.
Yep, that's right. I mean, it doesn't have to be a biological war because your point, which is exactly right, we have so many people doing experiments in so many places with so many different levels of capability that the mathematical potential of something much worse than COVID breaking loose is very real, which I think is why we ought to make rethinking our entire public health system a very, very high value and a very high priority. But I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, Biological War, a Scenario, once again, a New York Times bestseller. It's available now wherever books are sold. And I think it's a real contribution to America getting its act together and understanding what we have to do in order to survive and be both safe and prosperous and free. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to my guest, Annie Jacobsen. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and vote latest with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at Gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.